Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to continue our journey with Peter Brown from his book, The Love You Make. Well, it was my intention that with my videos I would go through every book on the Beatles I can find, because lately I've had some people say, they didn't think I should be using books that the Beatles didn't approve of, but I just thought that we could see what they had to say, and then we could decide for ourselves what we thought, and what we believe and what we don't believe. And then if anyone has a comment contradicting what was said in the book, that they could just make it in the comments, and then we can all, find out the truth that way. So I'm going to continue where we left off, because in the last video, Clive Epstein wanted to sell NEMS, which was renamed Nemperor, and he had a buyer lined up, but he was willing to give the Beatles a chance to buy it because 25% of their earnings for 9 years was going to go to Nemperor no matter who the owner was. So I wasn't sure I would cover the business wrangling that went on near the end, but it was more interesting than I thought it would be, and I really didn't know much about it. So we'll see what happens when the Beatles take their stand with the lawyers of their choosing. The Beatles asked for the meeting with Sir Joseph Lockwood from EMI, and the four of them had tea. Sir Joe was there at the conference room, and John Eastman told Sir Joe why they had come. They needed an immediate cash advance against royalties for £1,250,000. Sir Joe just asked, "When do you need it?" And Eastman said Wednesday afternoon. Allen Klein decided to pop into the picture at this time. He saw an interview where John had said, "If Apple goes on losing money at this rate, we'll be broke in 6 months." Allen kept calling the Apple office after Brian's death. Peter Brown and Clive met with him, but Peter found him foul-mouthed and abusive, and he ended the meeting in a few minutes and showed him the door just like Brian had done. After John's interview, Klein kept calling more and more, and Peter would intercept, but now Klein was insisting that he talk to John Lennon. Peter said it was impossible. And somehow Derek Taylor was being made to look like a bad guy by not letting Klein speak to John, so he asked Peter to turn over Klein's number to John, and Peter agreed. John and Yoko didn't let the other Beatles know, but they went to meet Klein in his suite at the Dorchester Hotel. John and Yoko liked him. Klein was blunt and he was common. Yoko liked his speech with four-letter words, thinking of him like a street fighter. John and Yoko liked that Klein had an appreciation of John's music. He was able to quote from every song of John's, which left John feeling flattered, and he was putty in Klein's hands. Klein promised John and Yoko that he would renegotiate the Beatles a much higher percentage of royalties of EMI, plus a huge cash advance that would solve their financial problems. He said he would get Nemperor. Clive received a letter from John Eastman stating, "As you know, Mr. Allen Klein is doing an audit of the Beatles' affairs vis-a-vis NEMS and Nemperor Holdings Limited. When this has been completed, I suggest we meet to discuss the results of Mr. Klein's audit, as well as the propriety of the negotiations surrounding the 9-year agreement between EMI and the Beatles and NEMS." Well, Clive and Queenie were mad about the implications of the letter, and John Eastman's father decided it was time he fly to London and have a meeting with Klein and the four Beatles. Klein said he had done research on Eastman and found out he had changed his name from Epstein. Throughout the meeting, John and Allen kept calling him Epstein. Eastman stayed calm until Klein began interrupting everything he said with a string of four-letter words. Finally, Lee Eastman had enough and got into a screaming match with Klein, and then he and Paul left the room. After that, Paul stopped attending most of the meetings and had a lawyer represent him. 3 days after receiving John Eastman's letter questioning the 9 years left on Nemperor contracts, Clive quickly and quietly sold Nemperor Holding and its 25% share to Leonard Richenberg at Triumph Trust before the tax year ended. I don't blame him. It sounded like chaos with all the lawyers battling it out. Triumph became a 90% holder of Nemperor. Clive was relieved and he packed his belongings and went back to Liverpool to raise his children in a house near Queenie's. He was a successful and contented businessman. The Beatles were stunned that they had lost Nemperor, and that led to finger-pointing. Klein, the three Beatles, even Leonard Richenberg put the blame on John Eastman for being too young and soft. Klein said he would get Nemperor back for them for free. February 25th, Klein went to see Richenberg at his office in the city and told him, "You're very smart to have jumped in first and bought NEMS, But what you don't know was that the Epsteins owed the Beatles huge sums of money from road shows. Klein went on to make dark threats about lawsuits that would destroy Triumph and Rickenboyer, as Klein called him. Richenberg wasn't fazed by Klein and showed him the door. Klein went back to the Beatles, including Paul, and got them to sign a letter to EMI which said that they said to pay Henry Anspacher and Company all royalties payable by you directly or indirectly to Beatles and Company or Apple Corporation. A letter went to Rickenberg at Triumph informing him that Nemperor no longer acted on behalf of the Beatles. Sir Joe at EMI had his hands full at first. Allen Klein had perfect timing. There were £1.3 million in royalties due to be paid shortly to the Nemperor. Second, Sir Joe knew that Klein intended to renegotiate the Beatles' recording contracts for a higher royalty and didn't want to make him an enemy at the moment. He was trying to be fair, so he did nothing, and Rickenberg called him a chicken. Rickenberg didn't wait a day to take the case to court. The Beatles ended up in the newspapers. The lawyers for Nemperor stated that Apple appears to have recently fallen under the influence of Allen Klein. He seems to have a dubious record. It was believed that if EMI paid the royalties to the Beatles, they might turn over the money to Klein, who might make away with it. EMI made it clear their position that after March the 5th, 1969, they would pay royalties to no one, and the judge saw no reason not to freeze the funds. Rickenberg was angry, and if Klein wanted a street fight, he was going to get one. Rickenberg hired a detective service to look into Klein, and they didn't have to dig deep to find out about Klein. He turned it over to the reporters at the Sunday Times. And April 13, 1969, an article by John Fielding appeared in the investigative column called Insight. In one part of the column, it was said that the Rolling Stones didn't get much of a deal out of Klein's efforts. He got them a $1.4 million advance against royalties, but the Stones weren't to see any of it very soon. The Stones expected the money to be deposited into their business account, Nanker Flinge Music Incorporated, and the money was deposited instead to a company named Nanker Flinge Music Incorporated, which was formed in the United States. All the money was invested in General Motors stock, which produced a high income, but didn't make its way to the Stones' pockets. Klein pointed out in his contractual agreement that he was only obligated to pay $1.4 million over a period of 20 years. Other things were mentioned in the article about other pending and dismissed lawsuits against Klein. Klein sued the Sunday Times, but it was too late. His name was going through the mud. Klein respected Rickenberg more and made a quick compromise with him. The Beatles bought back Triumph's 90% of Nemperor stocks for £800,000 cash, plus a quarter of the frozen assets of £1.3 million, along with £50,000 additional to Nemperor's share of Suba Films, the Beatles' film company. They had to pay Triumph 5% of their gross royalties from 1972 to 1976. Rickenberg outdid himself by convincing the Beatles to trade the 10% of the stock they already owned in Nemperor for nearly $1 million of Triumph stock, neatly making the Beatles shareholders in Triumph. Klein was taking credit for the event, saying it was his masterful dealing that had won their 25% back for them, but John Eastman said, before memories become too short, he wrote each of the Beatles, "I want to remind everybody that we could have settled the NEMS affair for very little. Klein killed my deal. He claimed NEMS was doing improper acts, but it was Klein that was doing them." We do know that NEMS tied up £1,400,000 of Beatles photograph recording royalties, which Klein had been unable to free. So these are the facts, and I shall be more than pleased to show you. On March the 12th, 1969, Paul got married to Linda. She was pregnant, and none of the Beatles were there. Paul's brother Michael was there, Mal Evans and Peter Brown. John and Yoko said they couldn't be there because they were putting the finishing touches on an album called Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions, and Ringo and Maureen were busy at home, and George was attending work at Apple. And on that same morning, Pattie Harrison drove to London to pick up a dress to wear to a Pisces party. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were supposed to be there, so Pattie wanted a special dress to wear. Pattie parked her car in the street down the block from Clark's salon, and when she came out a short time later, she found someone had put a pack of Rothman cigarettes on the dashboard. and inside the cigarette pack was a phone number and a man's name with the message, "Phone me." And there was hashish. Pattie put it in her pocketbook and went back to Kim Fawn's, and that was her home in Esher. When she got out of the bathtub, the doorbell rang, and she saw 3 or 4 cars pulling up in the drive. When she opened the door, it was Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher with 8 policemen and a drug-sniffing canine named Yogi. He said, "We're looking for drugs," and she said, "I'm terribly sorry, but we don't have any." And they, of course, started to search the house and made a beeline for the chip of hashish in the cigarette pack. She had the feeling she had been set up, and she tried to explain the cigarette pack. Then she tried to call Peter, but he was at Paul's marriage ceremony. Then she called George and told him it's a bust, and he said, "No, stop it, don't joke." She said, "I'm serious." George went back, but it took him 2 hours. Pattie asked the detective why he was doing it, and he said to save you from the perils of heroin. And one policeman came up with a small brick of hashish that Pattie hadn't seen before. Yogi the dog found it in the bedroom closet in one of George's shoes. She said they were lying. If they had that much of it, they wouldn't hide it in George's shoes. And if you're looking for grass, we keep it in the sitting room on a table in a cigarette box. When George got there, they were taken in for arraignment, but they were released from jail, and they still decided to go to that party. And then they went up in a small circle where Princess Margaret was there. George told her that Pilcher planted hash in his shoe. Princess Margaret said, "Oh my, what a shame." And George asked her if she could help them, and she said, "Oh, I don't think so." And then later, when someone tried to pass a joint to Princess Margaret, she turned and left the party with Lord Stone following her. Pattie and George were fined 500 pounds for the possession of drugs on March 31st. So I will end the video here. Brian dying had the sharks circling the water, and everyone wanted to be a part of the Beatles' income. It sounded like if they had gone along with John Eastman's plans, they could have ended up in better shape. Instead, John, Yoko, George, and Ringo decided to go with the crass Allen Klein. A settlement was reached, but it wasn't as good as it could have been. Next, Paul found marriage to Linda with a baby on the way, and no one but Moll and Peter showed up, along with his brother Michael. Then that same day, George Harrison and Pattie were taken in for drug possession, but were released, and somehow they still felt like going to a party. They even tried to get Princess Margaret to help them out, but she wanted no part of that. Can't say I blame her. So being rich can have its perks, but it can also have its pitfalls, with everyone trying to get some of your dough. So I'm glad I don't have to worry about any of that. So I hope everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. Tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.